I was going out of the city to celebrate Passover. While Jesus, was being led out of the city to become the Passover lamb. We didn't have any idea. You see, I was determined to celebrate Passover this year in Jerusalem. I'd celebrated for years, but never had come to the holy city. And when I got there, the city was an incredible sight. Just as beautiful as I had imagined. A sight I wasn't expecting. And the crowd seemed 10 times larger than any other Passover I'd ever seen. But it was different somehow. There were angry mobs everywhere in the street and people that just seemed to be unrest everywhere in the city. And people kept shouting the name, Jesus or Yeshua. Some were crying. Roman guards were moving back as this man came in, and he had this beam across his back. He was bloodied beyond recognition. He was making his way down the streets. You see, the guards were leading him to this place called the Skull, which most people call Golgotha. And as I was trying to make sense of the anger and the shouting and the screaming, the weeping, all these things, all of a sudden this Roman guard grabbed me. He literally pulled me from the crowd, and he ordered me to carry the cross. I traveled this long distance, 1,500 miles, to celebrate, to spend time with my son and to show him the Passover lamb. But if I carried the cross, his blood would stain me and prevent me from celebrating the Passover. I would be unclean. I froze. I didn't know what to do, but the Romans have authority over us. They can order us to carry it for at least a mile, sometimes even more. But then I saw him. I saw what this commotion was all about. This man who claimed to be the Son of God, this Yeshua, he called himself the Messiah, the Christ. I saw him with my own 2 eyes. And I couldn't pull myself away from him. Or should I say, what was left of him? His body. It was mutilated. It was to the point where I hardly could see a man behind the blood, like pounds of flesh beaten. And yet somehow, he was standing upright. I don't know how he did it. His eyes met mine. He looked me right in the eyes. And when I saw his eyes, I could tell this wasn't a criminal or a crazed man, as some people had led us to believe. He wasn't some kind of crazy person with grandiose ideas that take over the country. This was a true encounter with the one who was sent by God, the Messiah, Messiah. He was carrying his cross, step by step, barely able to stand, dragging this beam. And I told myself, don't cause trouble with the Romans. Just carry his cross. Take up his cross, Simon. Just go do it. Forget about the Passover. Forget about the sacrifices. Just carry the cross. So I took whatever courage I had left and I put my arm around Jesus. And as we walked, I felt the weight of the cross on my shoulders and upon my back. As I was also trying to help Jesus, whose knees kept buckling underneath him. The weight seemed to go beyond the wooden cross, as though he was carrying the weight of the world upon him. The walk seemed like it took forever. Well, we kept walking together. I carried what I could, but he was carrying so much more. I heard the insults to him, and now to me. I could feel the spit. I felt his blood on my skin. I could see the scars and the wounds all over his body, where they had ripped the flesh from him. I could see the crown of thorns that had been mashed into his head, those thick thorns that were piercing like nails into his skull, and how the blood ran into his eyes. And I heard the people yell, "Where is your heavenly Father now?" The laughing, the mocking, the screams. It was all too much. They took him to this place called Calvary. They placed him on this Roman cross. And I can remember still the sound of the steel being nailed into his hands and into his feet. They stood him upright. And I watched him as they placed him silhouetted against the sky. Part of me wanted to leave. Part of me wanted just to get away from this torture, the screaming, the smells, the ridicule. But somehow I couldn't take my eyes off him. For 6 hours, he strained to stretch as far as he could to get air in his lungs. Every time he would put down his feet, he would gasp for breath and the blood would come gurgling out, and then he would try to stand again. This torture took on for hours and hours. I looked down during this time. I could see my hands stained with the blood of the Yeshua, the Messiah. Part of me was worried about his blood making me unclean. But as I stood there long enough, I began to realize it was through his blood. It was through the stains on my hands and on my cloak that actually made me clean. That made all of us clean. I'm not sure how it happened or when it happened or exactly the timing of it all, but all of a sudden I could hear this gasping for air. And I looked up and I could see that his head had hung down and he had taken his last breath and he died. I saw the spear come out of the Roman guards and he pierced him in the side. And I could see the darkness had fell as there was a trembling that took place. That day, I picked up my cross. I helped Jesus carry my cross. He carried the cross for the world, for you and for me. And Jesus hung his head and he died on my cross.